this filing. It is a monster filing in the Tyler Robinson case. This, of course, is the briefing to kind of get everyone up to speed and refamiliarize everyone with where we are in the case. So we had the initial hearing. However, the judge has yet to make his ruling. It was decided at the end of that hearing that I attended out in Utah, in that courthouse, that hot courthouse in the middle of the summer, that in the high desert, that there would be two briefs, the state, the defense, and then the judge would make his decision. There's going to be oral arguments on September 1st, about 2 weeks' time. The defense has filed their motion here. And from my reading, it seems that their biggest focus is on trying to get the death penalty off the table. That seems to be clearly what they're focused on here. I read the entire thing this morning. It was the first thing I did when I woke up and I saw this came. I read every single word of it, and now we're here to break it down. But because I'm not a lawyer, I wanted to get the best lawyer I could on it, and that's why I got Andrew Branca, host of the Andrew Branca Show. Andrew, how are you?
I'm doing great, man. How are you doing?
Well, I'm in this position where I think I've got some thoughts about about this briefing, but I want to get it straight from the lawyer. That's why I brought you on. But look, this to me, what jumped out here is it seems to me their biggest focus isn't necessarily on, the points of the evidence itself. It's really more on these enhancements, these aggravating factors, which would trigger in Utah, under Utah law, the death penalty.
Right. So the only capital charge here is that aggravated murder charge, and it's based on the allegation that Robinson knowingly created a great risk of death to others besides Charlie. If that's the case, then the jury would find for that. They'd be looking at the death penalty. And anytime you're a defense attorney and you have a client looking at the death penalty, victory is essentially defined as your client does not get the death penalty. They get convicted on all the other stuff, that's fine, as long as they're not sentenced to death. So that's their primary concern. They do some hand waving here on the other charges, but it's important to keep in mind what the standard of proof is here. We're not trying to determine guilt on the merits. We're just trying to decide, is there evidence from which a unbiased jury could rationally find that these charges have been proven? It's essentially a probable cause level of proof. And unfortunately for the defense, there just clearly is. I mean, there's vastly more than enough evidence for a jury to consider. We don't have a circumstance here where no jury could rationally conclude guilt. It's not there. And even on this aggravating factor, which would be the most vulnerable, it's the one the courts will be most sensitive to because it carries a death penalty. The arguments the defense is making that there was not a knowing creation of a risk of death to others simply doesn't hold water here.
Yeah, so I read that part, and so there's two, if I understand this correctly, there's two counts, aggravating counts that they're adding to this, one being that it was done in the presence of minors and that it could have threatened others,
right?
And then also this political targeting. And on the one that you just mentioned, the fact that it took place in the presence of minors, they're making this strange argument that Tyler Robinson, when he was on the roof, or as they say, the shooter was on the roof. And by the way, they don't dispute that there was a shooter on the roof, that a shooter can be seen on the roof, that the shooter took a shot on the roof, that the bullet came from the roof, that it was on a downward trajectory, it entered Charlie's neck, et cetera, et cetera. All of the things that we see on the video and that those of us who were in court and watched the video reported in real time. None of that is disputed. In fact, all of it is stipulated by the defense team. But what they argue is that the shooter could not have known from that line of sight that children were in the crowd and, in fact, fired over the crowd and not through the crowd. Now, look, again, I'm not a lawyer. That doesn't sound like a very strong argument to me.
Oh, it's not, especially since there's other things that Tyler Robinson knew. I mean, he had walked around the area prior. He knew the kinds of people that were there. He knew children were in the area. Well, are we supposed to believe that he thought for some reason that all the children that were there when he first walked through were gone when he decided to fire the shot? That's simply not credible. He would have no reason to believe that.
No, that's exactly right. And in addition to that, so when they talked about the political motive, I noticed that one thing that was argued at great length during the hearing was not found anywhere in their brief, and that, of course, was the etchings on the bullets, which I've always held is where the shooter told the entire world what his motive was. You see trans slogans, and you see anti-fascist Antifa slogans on multiple bullets. It's as clear as day. I couldn't see a single reference to that here.
Well, they don't want to talk about the evidence that's harmful to them in this filing, of course. That's the job of the state to do. But again, this is evidence that's in the record that a jury at trial will be free to consider. So that there are facts for a jury to come to a conclusion of guilt. For them to win on this, none of these facts would have to be in evidence, which is why they're simply not talking about them in this filing.
That's precisely right.
We're supposed to forget.
Oh, right. And of course, the state does obviously reference this in their filing, and of course, brought it up at the hearing. And if the oral arguments do take place on September 1st, as is scheduled, pending any changes. Of course, we've seen a lot of delays in this case already. That I am certain that if there's a question of motive, that's going to be the first thing that's brought up. Now, another piece of this, though, is that I did want to dig in that. It seems to me as though there's a number of points here where the defense is making stipulations. There's a part where they talk about, and I tweeted this out earlier, where they talk about the stairwell footage, and they say that the video evidence shows Mr. Robinson walking up and down stairs at UVU with a gait impaired by something long in his pant leg. The reasonable inference from the evidence provided is that it was a fully assembled rifle. Now, I don't know that I would agree that that you obviously know that it's a fully assembled rifle, but some kind of rifle, that's certainly for sure. But it also seems to me that that with this, they're pointing out that the video evidence shows their client on the campus at the time of the crime.
Yeah, so an inference, of course, is when you're coming to a conclusion not based on direct evidence, but from circumstantial evidence. You're observing something, you're saying, well, this suggests that this other thing is true as well. And there's a difference between inference and speculation, and they try to conflate that in this filing. Speculation is when you're coming to the conclusion based on no evidence. That's the difference between an inference, where you're actually just extending things you're observing. Obviously, the limp could mean it would be a reasonable inference. There's something that's causing the limp. It could be a rifle in the pants. Speculation would be, for all we knew, he had 3 rifles. There's no evidence to support that. What was interesting to me is I'm not sure I would go so far as to say that they're explicitly stipulating a lot of these things, but they don't have any counter argument. I mean, all the evidence is consistent with what the state's narrative of guilt is here, and they have nothing to the contrary.
Right. You don't see anything. And by the way, if I'm going to have to go and check again, but I didn't see very much response to all the DNA evidence, for example, or fingerprints, or so many other things that came up at the hearing that, again, in these 41 pages are just not found.
They don't mention DNA at all that I can recall in this 41 pages.
I'm running my Control F right now, and I just don't see it.
Right. Yeah, nothing in there about it. Again, they don't want to talk about the things that they don't have an answer to, and that's one of them.
Right. And so when you're looking at all of this, does it seem, and I'll just ask you your opinion here, does this seem like it is their strategy then is, kind of saying, all right, we think this is going to be bound over, it's going to trial, and they're working backwards from a potential death penalty?
Yeah, they very much, of course, would like the death penalty off the table. This whole knowing creation of a risk to others, for example, it's kind of silly when you think about the other arguments that have been made in this case. Now, we know from the forensics, for example, that the bullet fired into Charlie fragmented, stayed in his body. There was not an exit wound. That's not what I would expect from a .30-06 round, but it can happen from a .30-06 round. There's no question about that. It's within the realm of reasonable terminal ballistics for that kind of round. But now they're trying to say, the defense is trying to say, well, no, I mean, these bullets operate like lasers. There can be no deflection. There can be no ricochet. There could be no risk to other people. Only Charlie was possibly at risk from this high-powered rifle round. When, in fact, they cite the Supreme Court of Utah decisions on this issue, and those decisions explicitly talk about things like the risk of a ricochet, the risk of a stray bullet. All of those are clearly present here as the creation of a knowing great risk of death to others. Their own citations are not supportive of their efforts to try to get this excluded.
You're coming up on a quick break, but one of the things that they brought up at the hearing as well, that the prosecution brought up, was the fact that the tent behind Charlie, it's sort of an opaque white wall, but again, it's still a tent. It's not going to deflect anything. If he had missed, if the shooter missed, anyone standing behind there, walking behind there, students, staff, faculty, children, anyone would have been at risk. And in fact, the shooter had no way of knowing who was behind that tent at the time, which I would say the reasonable inference would be that that does create a knowing risk of death to others.